I am, of course, joined by our very own SABC News reporter, Samkelo Maseko, just to unpack where we are right now as we wait, in fact, to kick off the program of the conference. Again, 8:30 we were supposed to be seeing the prayer session taking place. I mean, at this point, we should have already seen the president of the party, according to the program given to the media. The president already, just after 9 o'clock, expected to give his political report. We haven't gotten there yet. Is this a sense of the disarray that the party finds itself in?
Well, Naledi, the first important issue that you need to tackle is that the registration issue. Should those delegates outside that registration venue barge into the registration center of the delegates, that would have a huge impact on the credentials of conference, because that would essentially mean that the registration process has been tampered with and has had a gap in it, and that would be a bone of contention in the conference in itself. That's why we had to see that roller door having to be closed, because they can't afford to have that registration venue of the delegates compromised, because that would essentially compromise the legitimacy of this conference, because the legitimacy of the delegates, over the 4,000 delegates that would be inside this conference venue here at Nasrec, would then be questioned and would open up this conference to litigation issues. That is why that was most critical for the ANC to close that entire registration process down. That is why the president of the ANC, he arrived here in the morning at about 9 o'clock. Shortly after his arrival, 30 minutes later, the acting secretary general of the ANC, Paul Mashatile, arrived. He is already inside the venue himself. Some leaders of the ANC top six, Gwede Mantashe, most of them have arrived inside here. And that registration process is pretty much what is stalling the conference of the ANC. In previous years, the conferences of the ANC, the registration process, pre-registration, would be done at a provincial level. When it comes to the national level, delegates would only be collecting their tags. It speaks to the disorganization of Luthuli House and having no permanent individuals in the SGO office of the African National Congress.
I mean, you talk about if those roller doors are to be forced open by delegates who are trying to get their accreditation in those live images that we showed you, opening up the party to litigation. We've seen the party facing litigation just this week in the run-up to the election, where members of the party were concerned about even the nominations list going into the NEC. So it seems that there is a distrust in the process of the party.
There is a huge distrust amongst ANC leaders, amongst themselves alone, and they don't trust one another. You look at the preparations towards conferences, you look at the litigation issues, you look at the fights over credentials, some alleging that they're bogus delegates at conferences. You go to the Northwest Provincial Conference, there were allegations of tags being printed. You just go to the recent conference of the ANC Youth League in KwaZulu-Natal, which collapsed. Tags seen being printed in South Beach of bogus delegates allegedly in that conference. So the issue of credentials becomes very important at conferences, because if you lose the issue of credentials, that is where you will win or lose a conference. That's why in that registration venue, they had to put down those roller doors, because if you compromise the registration processes of delegates, it creates chaos in plenary of conference, because the issue of delegates and their tags being at conference becomes a bone of contention, which is then becomes a huge issue within these conferences. And those are some of the issues that particularly the ANC, when it comes to the cleaning up of credentials, for instance, that's why they have continuous meetings of the Credentials Committee to try and clean those credentials. You go to the Eastern Cape Provincial Conference, it took them 2 days to adopt credentials. You go to some of the provincial conferences that have, the Gauteng Provincial Conference took about 3 days for them to adopt those credentials. At the time when the president of the ANC was meant to address that particular conference, they had not adopted credentials, and he was then going abroad, which then brings about how the credentials stall conferences of the ANC. But first, the registration process, it is usually smooth. This time around, they've been disorganized as the ANC at HQ when it comes to the registration of these delegates. Normally, for the registration of provinces, for instance, KwaZulu-Natal was the first province to register its delegates yesterday. That was a long, protracted process. At some point, there was load shedding and the whole system collapsed. Hence, yesterday evening, at about 10:30 in the evening, Gauteng was registering their delegates. They were not done. They were supposed to register their delegates as Gauteng at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They were only going into the registration process at 10:30 in the evening. It speaks to the slow process that the ANC and how disorganized they are at HQ when it comes to the organization of the registration of delegates.
Yeah, well, one thing's for sure is that this is a clear sign that it is going to be a very long few days as we bring you the elective conference of the African National Congress. Another big issue, of course, having come up just last night is the matter of a private prosecution matter by former President Jacob Zuma. And you heard Phemima Jordina there speaking to Griselda Lewis, essentially saying those who want to go to court can go to court, but this conference is going ahead and that the leadership will be chosen. Sophie Mokoena of the SABC spoke to Vincent Magwenya about that very matter. Take a look.
Case. We are told there's a private prosecution that has been instituted by the former President Ramaphosa's predecessor.
Yeah, that case is problematic on many fronts. One, there is no nolle prosequi certificate. Secondly, when former President Zuma raised the complaint against advocates Downer and Breitenbach, the President responded to him and communicated the action he had taken, which was to refer the matter to Minister Lamula, to also then lodge the matter with the Legal Practice Council, which is what you will do. To expect the President to interfere with the workings of an independent prosecutorial agency is quite problematic. We've been there before as a country. We do not want to return to that position.
How is the President?
I mean, that's certainly an interesting matter, that, because it speaks once again, Samkelo, to the fractures that the party is going into this conference with. The issue particularly that we heard last night of that private prosecution by that the former president wants to embark on. Your thoughts when you got those news last night?
It tells you of the exacerbated political tensions and divisions within the governing party. It tells you the extent of the divisions between President Ramaphosa and his predecessor, former President Jacob Zuma. You just go to the visuals last night that were emanating from the delegates of the registration process when former President Jacob Zuma went to get his tag. For former President Zuma, he's a voting delegate to this conference. He's delegate number 1 from his branch in Nkandla, where he is a member in the Musa Dladla region in KwaZulu-Natal. So he's a voting delegate. He will be seated amongst delegates. He will not be seated amongst NEC members as an actual ex-official member of the NEC. So he's going to be a voting delegate. Sure. He came here as an ordinary branch member of the African National Congress. He will have an opportunity to cast a vote of whoever his desired presidential candidate is in this conference. So it tells you the extent of the divisions between the. You just listen to Phemima Jordina, ANC NEC member and chief whip, speaking about how this organization defended former President Jacob Zuma, saying he must allow the incumbent president to lead. You look at how there's been this back and forth between these leaders. You look at that open letter Cyril Ramaphosa wrote to ANC members, saying that the ANC stands as accused number 1 when it comes to corruption within the country, saying that divisions and the extent of corruption in the governing party has eroded the politics and that ANC is ideologically and intellectually bankrupt. You look at the rebuttal that came from former President Jacob Zuma, saying that Cyril Ramaphosa is wrong to say that the ANC stands as accused number 1 when it comes to corruption. You look at how the former president has been so vocal, particularly in the past few weeks, since he was his sentence had expired when he was sentenced to 15 months incarceration. How he literally called the incumbent president isgebengu when it comes to the issues pertaining to the Section 89 report and the 580,000 allegedly US dollars that were found at the president's farm, and how he is essentially saying that civil society, the NGOs that were vocal during his era of supposed state capture and corruption, how they spoke out of what was happening in his era as the president of the country, and how quiet they are now in the era of President Cyril Ramaphosa, and the revelations that are coming out of his Phala Phala farm, and the revelations being revealed by former state security boss and former Commissioner of Correctional Services Arthur Fraser, who has just filed an affidavit questioning and seeking to set aside certain aspects of the state capture report by then Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who was the chairperson of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, which further fuels the divisions within the governing party, because the divisions emanating in the ANC all begin when it comes to the state apparatus, the levers of power, the dispersing of patronage within government, and those who are in power have control of certain branches and certain regions, which essentially will then determine who leads the African National Congress at the end of the day, which are some of the issues that are at the heart of the leadership contestations within the ANC, which is not about ordinary certificates, but about them controlling the levers of the leadership of the ANC.
You paint an interesting picture when you talk about former President Jacob Zuma not up with the NEC members, sitting with the normal branch delegates here at this conference. But I still believe that, and perhaps you can tell me if I'm wrong here, that July 2021 is still hanging over the shoulder of the African National Congress going into this conference. Where that 8 days of looting, 365 lives lost as a result of the imprisonment of Jacob Zuma, does that still show the power that he might have within the party?
To a certain extent, it does show the power that he has within the party, but that can be rebutted with the various branch nominations that have taken place within the ANC. You look at former President Jacob Zuma on the eve of Begim Tolo, the provincial secretary of the ANC, speaking about the endorsement of that province. He released a midnight letter endorsing Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, saying that he's not moved from the position that they had in 2017. Also saying that he's availing himself as the national chairperson of the ANC. He failed to meet threshold to qualify through branch nominations and provincial nominations to be on the ballot paper for this conference. He's failed to do that. Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma has failed to also appear on the ballot paper for this conference. So the power of former President Jacob Zuma within the ANC, in my view, has dwindled. It's waned off. He no longer controls his own province of KwaZulu-Natal. Power in KwaZulu-Natal has now shifted from Nkandla in KwaDunusa and shifted to Moses Mabhida region in Willowfontein, where Dr. Zwelini Mkhize comes from. That is where power is currently within the power dynamics in the ANC. Shortly, in about 30 or 40 minutes time, we're going to have an exclusive interview with the suspended Secretary General of the ANC in some location around here. He tried to foster a meeting last night between former President Jacob Zuma, Dr. Zwelini Mkhize, Lindiwe Sisulu, and Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma to try and get these groupings that seemingly agree that Cyril Ramaphosa should be removed as president, so that they can club up together and give their votes to Dr. Zwelini Mkhize. Former President Jacob Zuma has been very clear that he's not moved from his position. He does not want to be associated with Dr. Zwelini Mkhize. So you've got an Ace Mahashule who's trying to broker a deal between these two powerful forces in KwaZulu-Natal, whom are seemingly not seeing eye to eye, which has an impact on their national campaign, trying to win this national conference of the ANC.
Let's talk a little bit about Phala Phala. Obviously, a really big issue. We're expecting that the Integrity Committee is also going to be sharing with us their report on what the direction of the party is going to be with regards to Phala Phala. But with the voting of the Section 89 report in Parliament, you saw some members of the party in the National Assembly, one of them being Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, voting outside of the party lines just days afterwards. Then an announcement that it might very well be possible that she and those that voted with her may face disciplinary processes within the party. We're hearing this morning, though, from Chief Whip and NEC member Pemi Majodina, as well as Pule Mabe, national spokesperson, that decision of whether or not those members will face disciplinary processes has been deferred to the incoming NEC. Is that the smart thing for the party to do?
It is a smart thing for the party to do, because once you debate the issue of who voted against the party or who voted with the opposition when it comes to this Section 89 report, the ANC is a hypocritical organization. It sometimes forgets historical matters that happened in the party. When the Nkandla report was tabled before Parliament on former President Jacob Zuma, the votes of no confidence against the former president, Fikile Mbalula, in this same venue here at Nasrec, called some of the NEC members of the ANC who were going to vote against the party line suicide bombers. You had Makosi Khoza, Dr. Makosi Khoza. You had likes of Mondli Gungubele. You had the likes of Derek Honeycomb, whom the EFF, Godrich Gadi and Julius Malema have openly said they plotted with Derek Honeycomb to dethrone former President Jacob Zuma. You've got the recent revelations of Lindiwe Sisulu speaking with the very same Godrich Gadi, planning and speaking about the ANC processes and plotting to vote against the Section 89 report of the ANC was voting against in Parliament. So ANC leaders from various epochs since former President Jacob Zuma came into power have always at certain instances voted with their conscience against the party line. And it's not Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Msebenzi Zwane, Supremo Hamapilo doing it for the very first time. Others have done it before. They weren't charged. So why charge these ones now? The ANC is a very hypocritical organization. Sometimes it chooses who they discipline at what point in time, depending on which faction is dominant at the time and leading the party.
And yet you're hearing the national spokesperson of the party, Bule Mabe, this morning in his press briefing, essentially saying that the party is going to be operating with uniformity as it makes those decisions around its disciplinary processes. If you have just joined us, it is now 11 a.m. Good morning to you. You're watching The Agenda. My name is Naledi Moleo. We're coming to you live from Nasrec in Johannesburg as we bring you the 55th National Conference of the African National Congress.